Air travel is supposed to be the safest way to get from one place to another, but some flights never follow the plan. Imagine boarding a plane, only to pass out mid-air and never wake up, or seeing your captain sucked halfway out of the cockpit window at 23,000 feet. In one case, a passenger simply vanished without a trace. No one saw him leave. No one saw him again. These aren't movie plots. They're real events that happened thousands of feet above the Earth, and they're more terrifying than fiction. Today, we're diving into the most bizarre, shocking, and unexplained mid-air incidents you've never heard of. Brace yourself, because once you're in the air, escape isn't an option. One meal took down a plane. What began as a dream vacation quickly spiraled into a nightmare. A Japan Airlines flight carrying 344 people from Tokyo to Paris via Alaska and Denmark was meant to be a celebratory trip, mostly filled with Coca-Cola employees who had earned a free European getaway. But what awaited them in the sky wasn't luxury. It was food poisoning on a catastrophic scale. Midway through the flight, just 30 minutes before landing in Copenhagen, flight attendants served ham omelets for breakfast. Within minutes, chaos broke out. Nearly 150 passengers became violently ill, vomiting, diarrhea, cramping, all at once. The plane's limited number of bathrooms couldn't handle the sudden crisis. Thankfully, the pilots hadn't eaten the breakfast, opting for steak instead. If they had, it's likely they wouldn't have been able to land the plane safely. As it was, they managed an emergency landing, and dozens of passengers were rushed to hospitals, 30 in critical condition. There was another problem. Almost none of the patients spoke Danish or English. In a scramble, local Japanese restaurants were contacted, and staff rushed to hospitals to translate during the emergency. What went so wrong? Investigators discovered that the culprit was a toxic bacteria, Staphylococcus aureus, found in the omelettes. But the real story was far worse than spoiled eggs. The meals had been made in Anchorage and stored under unsafe conditions for 28 hours, at temperatures too warm to prevent bacterial growth. Worse still, the cook who prepared the contaminated omelettes had lesions on his fingers, bandaged but infected. He never reported them. His managers never checked. It was a cascade of negligence, poor storage, a sick cook, no health screening. Any single failure might have been manageable, but altogether, it created a perfect storm. Tragically, the incident had one fatality. Kenji Kuwabara, Japan Airlines catering vice president and manager of the Anchorage facility, took his own life days later, unable to cope with the shame and responsibility. Though no passengers died, this event became a wake-up call for the airline industry. Since then, many airlines have adopted a new rule. Pilots and co-pilots must eat different meals, prepared separately, to avoid a full crew shutdown from foodborne illness. But disturbingly, even today, airline food safety is far from perfect. In the US, the FDA inspects airline catering companies far less frequently than restaurants, sometimes just once every 3 to 5 years. Reports have found expired food, moldy bread, insect infestations, and meat stored at incorrect temperatures. Yet, no caterers have been shut down. So what can passengers do? Experts recommend avoiding high-risk foods on flights: dairy, deli meats, raw fruits and veggies, shrimp, rice, and even ice. Stick to heated meals like soups and stews, or sealed snacks like bread rolls and crackers. They're safer bets at 30,000 feet. In the end, that breakfast omelette was more than just a bad meal. It was nearly a disaster. Still planning that vacation? Just maybe? Pack your own snacks. As shocking as it is, it's far from the only bizarre thing to ever happen mid-air. From unconscious passengers to captains being sucked out of the cockpit, here are some of the strangest and most terrifying in-flight disasters you've probably never heard of. Math error turns jet into glider at 41,000 feet. What happens when a state-of-the-art Boeing 767 runs out of fuel, mid-flight? A terrifying silence. That's exactly what happened to Air Canada Flight 143 on July 23, 1983. The flight, en route from Montreal to Edmonton, began as any other. But at 41,000 feet over central Canada, both engines suddenly died. The reason? A simple but catastrophic unit conversion mistake. Ground crews had used pounds instead of kilograms when fueling the plane, resulting in half the required fuel. Suddenly, this massive jetliner became a glider, with no power, no propulsion, and no margin for error. The pilots, Captain Bob Pearson and First Officer Maurice Quintal, had no engine power, no instruments, and no thrust reversers to help land. They had to rely entirely on gliding calculations and sheer instinct. Their saving grace? Quintal remembered an old Royal Canadian Air Force base in Gimli, Manitoba. What he didn't know was that the base had been turned into a drag racing strip and was packed with people that day. With both engines out, hydraulics limited, and no landing gear fully locked, the pilots managed a textbook emergency landing on the runway, just meters away from spectators. The nose gear collapsed, sparks flew, but miraculously, everyone survived. The incident earned the aircraft the nickname the Gimli Glider, and the crew became instant legends in aviation. The takeaway? In aviation, even a simple math error can spiral into disaster. But thanks to a rare combination of calm decision-making and pilot skill, a tragic crash was narrowly avoided. Singapore Airlines flight grounded by farting sheep. It sounds like a joke, but it really happened. In 2015, a Singapore Airlines cargo flight from Sydney to Kuala Lumpur had to make an unexpected emergency landing because of farting sheep. The Boeing 747 freighter was carrying over 2,000 live sheep in the cargo hold. About halfway through the flight, the crew was alerted by the aircraft's fire detection system, which indicated smoke in the lower deck. Following standard safety protocol, the pilots diverted the plane and made an emergency landing in Bali, Indonesia. But when emergency crews boarded the aircraft, they found no fire, no smoke, just sheep. An investigation quickly revealed the bizarre truth. The combined methane emissions from the sheep's digestive systems, burps and flatulence, had built up in the cargo hold. In the enclosed space, this accumulation of gas mimicked the chemical signatures of smoke or fire, triggering the aircraft's sensitive alarm system. No humans, or sheep, were harmed, and the cargo was eventually delivered safely after checks and system resets. But the incident became a humorous footnote in aviation history, reminding us that even the most advanced technology isn't immune to nature and livestock. Who would have guessed that 2,186 sheep passing gas could ground a high-tech jumbo jet? Passenger lights fire to cook ramen on board. In 2022, Indian aviation authorities were left stunned and a little baffled after a bizarre and dangerous in-flight incident. A domestic flight in India had to issue a warning and report to the Directorate General of Civil Aviation, DGCA, when a passenger attempted to light an open flame on board the aircraft to cook instant noodles. Yes, you heard that right. The individual had smuggled a portable butane gas stove in their hand luggage, along with a cup of instant ramen. Midway through the flight, they pulled it out, casually set it up on the tray table, and lit the stove to boil water, completely ignoring all safety protocols and the basic rules of common sense. Fortunately, the cabin crew spotted the stunt before it escalated. They quickly extinguished the flame, confiscated the stove, and issued a mid-air reprimand. No injuries or major damage occurred, but the potential danger was enormous. On an aircraft, open flames are strictly prohibited due to the risk of onboard fires, which can spread rapidly in a pressurized, oxygen-rich environment. The incident triggered a formal investigation and raised serious questions about security screening procedures, especially since butane stoves are banned in both checked and carry-on luggage. Aviation officials reminded the public that an airplane is not a camping site, and that there are no Michelin star meals at 30,000 feet, no matter how hungry you get. The viral incident became a laughingstock on social media, but behind the humor lies a serious warning. One traveler's noodle craving could have turned into a flaming disaster. The ghost plane, Helios Airways, Flight 522. It's one of the most haunting aviation disasters in history, a flight that kept flying, even though almost no one on board was conscious. On August 14, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522, a Boeing 737, took off from Cyprus en route to Athens. But just minutes into the flight, something went terribly wrong. The cabin failed to pressurize properly. The pilots didn't realize the aircraft was climbing without sufficient oxygen. As they passed 18,000 feet, the thin air began taking its toll. One by one, passengers and crew passed out, including both pilots. The plane had now become a ghost ship in the sky, flying aimlessly on autopilot. For over 2 hours, the aircraft continued along its programmed course, with no one at the controls. Fighter jets were scrambled to intercept after air traffic controllers failed to make contact. When the jets approached, they saw a terrifying sight. The captain slumped over, passengers unresponsive, and a single person still moving, the flight attendant. That man, Andreas Prodromou, had regained brief consciousness using a portable oxygen tank. A trained flight attendant and licensed pilot, he made his way to the cockpit and tried to save the flight. Tragically, it was too late. The fuel ran out, the engines shut down, and the plane crashed into a hillside near Grammatico, Greece, killing all 121 people on board. The investigation later revealed that a pressurization switch had been left in manual mode after maintenance. Neither pilot noticed the error during pre-flight checks. The haunting nature of the Helios 522 disaster, where a plane flew for hours with its passengers silently unconscious, earned it the nickname, the Ghost Plane. It became a chilling reminder of how one tiny oversight in aviation can snowball into a catastrophe. The passenger who disappeared mid-flight. Imagine boarding a flight only for one of your fellow passengers to vanish mid-air, with no trace, no witnesses, and no answers. That's exactly what happened aboard Northwest Airlines Flight 305 in 1971, in what would become one of the most infamous aviation mysteries of all time, the case of D.B. Cooper. The flight, a routine 30-minute trip from Portland to Seattle, became legendary when a man using the alias Dan Cooper handed a note to a flight attendant claiming he had a bomb. Calm and polite, he demanded $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck on standby when the plane landed. The FBI complied. Cooper released the passengers and most of the crew in Seattle, but kept the flight crew on board. He then instructed them to fly toward Mexico at low altitude and speed, with the rear stairwell lowered. And somewhere over the forests of Washington state, he jumped, disappearing into the night. Despite an intense manhunt, nobody was ever found. No confirmed sightings, just a few bundles of cash that washed up years later, matching the serial numbers of the ransom. The world still doesn't know if D.B. Cooper survived the jump or perished. His identity remains unknown. The FBI officially closed the case in 2016, making it the only unsolved hijacking in US history. While this is the most famous case, there have been other mid-air disappearances too, most involving people jumping or falling from planes, whether accidentally or intentionally. In 2000, for instance, a mentally ill man escaped restraints and opened a door on a commercial plane, falling to his death. In 2013, another man vanished from a private flight, and his body was never recovered. Each of these stories highlights an unsettling truth. Even inside a sealed tube flying 30,000 feet above the Earth, people can vanish, and sometimes the sky keeps its secrets. The captain who was sucked out at 23,000 feet. On the morning of June 10, 1990, British Airways Flight 5390 took off from Birmingham, UK, bound for Malaga, Spain. It was supposed to be a routine flight. Instead, it became one of the most terrifying and miraculous survival stories in aviation history. At 23,000 feet, as the aircraft cruised over southern England, disaster struck. Suddenly, the left cockpit windshield blew out, causing explosive decompression. The force of the air rushing out was so intense that Captain Tim Lancaster was violently sucked halfway out of the aircraft. His legs were caught in the controls, and only his feet remained inside the cockpit. He was pinned to the fuselage, his upper body flailing outside the plane in 500-mile-per-hour winds and freezing temperatures. A flight attendant, Nigel Ogden, sprang into action, grabbing the captain's legs and holding on for dear life. Other crew members rushed in to help, bracing Lancaster's body as the co-pilot, First Officer Alistair Atchison, calmly took control of the aircraft. Despite deafening noise, oxygen masks dropping, and the terrifying belief that the captain was already dead, Atchison declared an emergency and diverted the flight to Southampton. But here's the twist. Captain Lancaster was still alive. After 22 minutes of being suspended outside a moving plane, battered by sub-zero air and rapid pressure changes, he somehow survived with only fractures, frostbite, and bruises. His crew's quick thinking and heroic teamwork saved his life, and everyone else is on board. The cause of the accident? A maintenance error. The windshield had recently been replaced, but 84 of the 90 bolts used were the wrong size, too short to hold the pane securely. It was a simple, invisible oversight that nearly cost 81 people their lives. Flight 5390 became a landmark case in aviation safety and engineering accountability, and it's still studied today as an example of calm under pressure, crew heroism, and miraculous survival. She didn't know she was pregnant. In April 2021, passengers aboard a Delta flight from Salt Lake City to Honolulu expected a relaxing journey to paradise. Among them was 38-year-old Lavinia Munga, traveling for a vacation with family. She had been feeling a little off that day, tired, crampy, but chalked it up to flying. A few hours into the flight, however, things took a dramatic turn. Lavinia's discomfort intensified. She stood up to head to the restroom and collapsed. Cabin crew rushed to her side, and that's when they realized she was in labor. The shocking twist? Lavinia had no idea she was pregnant. She was 29 weeks along and experiencing a cryptic pregnancy, a rare condition where physical signs of pregnancy are barely noticeable or even absent. There was no time to panic. No doctor on board, no delivery tools. Just 35,000 feet of altitude and a mother and baby in danger. Miraculously, fate intervened. Among the passengers were a doctor and 3 NICU nurses on their way to a medical conference. Together, with crew support, they turned the back row of the aircraft into a makeshift maternity ward. Using shoelaces to tie the umbilical cord, a smartwatch to track the baby's pulse, and no sterile equipment, they managed to deliver the premature baby safely mid-air. As the plane descended into Honolulu, medical teams were already waiting on the tarmac. Baby Raymond, weighing just 3 pounds, was rushed to a neonatal unit, and he survived. It was a miracle birth no one expected, least of all Lavinia, who boarded the plane a tourist and landed as a mother. The explosion that tore through the sky. On April 17, 2018, 149 people boarded Southwest Airlines Flight 1380 for a routine trip from New York to Dallas. It was a bright morning, and the Boeing 737 climbed smoothly to cruising altitude. Then, disaster struck. At 32,000 feet, passengers heard a deafening bang as the left engine suddenly exploded. A fractured fan blade, weakened by metal fatigue, tore through the engine casing and launched metal shrapnel into the side of the fuselage. The worst part? One of those fragments shattered a passenger window. The sudden breach in cabin pressure created a vacuum. Passenger Jennifer Reardon, seated next to the broken window, was partially sucked out of the plane. Passengers leapt to grab her, pulling her back inside, but she suffered fatal injuries. Inside the cockpit, Captain Tammy Jo Schultz, a former US Navy fighter pilot, immediately took control. Amid chaos, decompression, and panicked passengers, she remained calm. The plane descended rapidly as oxygen masks deployed. Some passengers were sending goodbye texts. With flawless focus, Schultz made an emergency landing in Philadelphia, saving 148 lives. She later described it as, "just another day using what we've trained for." The incident sparked immediate calls for stricter engine inspections and reminded the world that sometimes what stands between life and death in the sky is a calm mind under pressure. Jetliner became a boat. January 15, 2009. A routine flight turned into one of the most astonishing aviation survival stories in history. US Airways Flight 1549, an Airbus A320, took off from New York's LaGuardia Airport just after 3:25 p.m. The flight was bound for Charlotte, North Carolina, carrying 150 passengers and 5 crew members. In the cockpit were Captain Chesley Sully Sullenberger and First Officer Jeffrey Skiles, both highly experienced pilots. The weather was calm, visibility was good. Nothing suggested what was coming. Just 90 seconds after takeoff, as the aircraft climbed past 2,800 feet, the unthinkable happened. The plane struck a flock of Canadian geese. Within seconds, both engines failed, a complete loss of thrust. The cockpit filled with the smell of burning bird remains. All 70,000 pounds of jet were now gliding, silently, over one of the most densely populated cities on Earth. Bird strikes are not uncommon, but losing both engines simultaneously and at such a low altitude is extraordinarily rare. It left the crew with a terrifyingly short window, less than 4 minutes, to decide their next move. Air traffic control offered options: return to LaGuardia or divert to nearby Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. But Sully quickly realized they wouldn't make it to either. They were too low, too slow, and running out of time. That's when he made an unthinkable call. We're gonna be in the Hudson. With no engines, no power, and no runway, Sully guided the massive aircraft like a glider. As he and Skiles worked in calm coordination, they aimed the jet toward the icy Hudson River, a narrow ribbon of water wedged between skyscrapers and bridges. At 3:31 p.m., just 6 minutes after takeoff, the plane touched down on the river's surface, perfectly level. The water erupted around the fuselage as the A320 skipped to a stop near Midtown Manhattan. It didn't break apart. It didn't sink, at least not right away. The cabin erupted in cheers, tears, and disbelief. Passengers rushed to the exits as life rafts were deployed, and people climbed out onto the wings in freezing January air. Ferry boats and first responders arrived within minutes, pulling people to safety. All 155 people aboard survived. Not a single life lost. In the middle of New York City, at the height of rush hour, a full-sized jetliner had landed in a river, and no one died. The media dubbed it the miracle on the Hudson, but aviation experts called it a masterclass in skill and calm under pressure. Captain Sully was later hailed as a national hero, but he was quick to share credit with his co-pilot, crew, air traffic controllers, and the rescue teams who turned a potential catastrophe into a case study in survival. The incident led to sweeping changes in bird strike awareness, engine testing, and emergency preparedness training. What began as a short domestic flight became a moment that reminded the world what skilled human decision-making could accomplish, when every second and every life is on the line.